At 6:43 a.m. on January 30, 1944, the mist over a ridgeline on Bougainville thinned into bands of gray and brown, and the Hornet's nest revealed itself in pieces. A slit of black where a machine gun asserted a field of fire, a heap of earth crowned with foliage, a low concrete lip masking a firing aperture. The American battalion that morning knew only that advance had stopped. Men crouched and peered through foliage that looked like safety but was a promise. Tanks rolled up and offered steel and flame, but could not see the mouths of the enemy's holes. The island was a hard, green thing that favored concealment, and the defenders had stitched themselves into it. Casualties mounted as men moved into intervening fire lanes. The advance faltered. Staff Sergeant Jesse Ray Drowley was 24, a logger by trade and a soldier by necessity. He had been hardened by long days under pines and maples in Michigan, hands used to reading grain, tension, and the low give of great trunks. He carried with him a folded piece of paper that did not take up much room but took up everything he thought about. A telegram from the War Department, brief and formal, that had told him his younger brother, Robert J. Drowley, had been killed in action. Robert's handwriting clung to a scrap of a letter Jesse kept tucked inside his helmet, bright and full of small jokes, a boy's promise to come home. Those tokens had narrowed Jesse's horizon to two things: keep moving and keep others alive. The tactical problem at the Hornet's nest was straightforward in mechanical terms and maddening in practice. The infantry could not dislodge the defenders from their camouflaged bunkers without suffering heavy losses. Armor could bring flame to bear, but the engineering fit was improvised. Several light tanks, M3A1 Stuarts, recognized for their mobility, had been fitted hastily with flame projector gear, their 37mm guns removed to make room, their hulls modified to accept a flamethrower nozzle and fuel lines. The weapon worked in theory. Fire would purge the bunker, force defenders out, or neutralize them. In practice, the tanks were blind. Their gun sights and periscopes offered little when the enemy's firing slits were flush with ground and masked by vines. The crews could see incoming tracers and the ruptures in the tree line, but not the shallow apertures that fed the killing zones. When an armored prow pressed forward, the defenders fired into the flank of the tanks and the infantry that followed. The result was a halting, grinding stalemate with mounting American casualties. Command debated. Officers argued in clipped, professional tones for more reconnaissance, for a creeping barrage, for coordinated flanking maneuvers, solutions that took time, ammunition, or terrain that Bougainville did not always allow.
Lieutenant William Harrison of the Armored Section had been frank about the constraints. "We can throw flame," he told the company commanders on a map-strewn tarp, fingers on pencil trajectories. "But if we can't target the slits, it's a guessing game. The crews need eyes outside the armor, someone to point." There was a certain institutional reflex, too, procedures and lines of authority that separated infantry from armor, that favored doctrine over improvisation. That morning, under a canopy of humidity and the sound of distant artillery, those lines thinned into a problem requiring a single pragmatic choice. Jesse had reached that choice before anyone asked him to. He had come up through the ranks not by seeking glory, but by being useful. In Michigan, before the uniform, he had cut stands of timber alongside men who measured the worth of a man by his willingness to shoulder work and his eye for a problem. A winch jammed on a winter morning, a rigging would fail over a river. He learned to climb to odd angles, to test the bearing of rotten wood with bare hands, to read the sound of a rope. The skills transferred awkwardly into war. What is steady handling of rope became steady fingers on a hatch. What is finding a seam in bark became finding the seam in a bunker's camouflage. He was not reckless for bravado. He had a compact, pragmatic courage, the kind that made men the next to his life feel safer. When the lead tank stalled half a length forward and its crew rushed to fight a fire that had taken hold of its engine compartment after a near hit, Jesse did the unglamorous arithmetic quickly. Without direct observation, the flamethrower was a blunt instrument. With eyes outside, someone could point, guide the nozzle into the slits, and reduce the guesswork. With that in mind, he climbed. The first time Jesse mounted the tank was a small, loud thing. It was not cinematic in the way parades are. It was jagged, immediate. The hull was warm under his palms where the engine bled heat. Around him men shouted, short, essential phrases of command and warning. Incoming! Lay down! The cadence of action. A fire burned under the turret with acrid smoke that tasted like melted rubber. The smell of fuel and cordite braided in the air. He pulled his .45 from its holster and slung a strip of rations pack across his shoulder. Somebody, maybe Harrison or Rodriguez, grunted something that could be read as warning or permission. Jesse braced, wrapped his foot around a cleat, and hoisted himself up. Once on the hull, he found the world changed by three things: the recoil of engines under his feet, the shock of being exposed, and the need to be precise. Tanks move in their own slow geometry. The men inside are protected but isolated. Jesse could feel the skin of metal between him and the world he wanted to alter. He leaned forward and looked for apertures, for a blackness repeating like a pattern between ferns. He cupped his hands and shouted short directions down to the nozzle crew. Left a little. Now! Hold! The flamethrower answered honorably when someone pointed it. Torrents of flame rolled in a controlled sheet into the Earth's mouth, heat ripping up a moment of target clarity. The defenders yelped and shifting debris filled the air with a choking, papery smell. In several seconds, the pattern of fire and silence changed. Those first seconds were the pivot. Infantry that had been pinned rose in small, staggered waves and found that some pockets of lethal coverage had been reduced to ash and smoke. The lead tank's crew, whom Jesse later helped pull from under burning flares, said simply that he had given us the sight we needed. The records that would follow used words like initiative and gallantry. Men who had watched from foxholes would later commit the phrase, Jesse's eyes, into letters sent across months and years. Under fire, the language of command is spare. Jesse's instructions then were abridged phrases and gestures. Now, he would bark, straight on that slit, don't fall left. The tank would heave in obedience and the flame would pour. Sometimes the defenders tried to counter with grenades and angled bursts, and the tank would lurch, but Jesse clung and kept the direction. At one point, the turret smoke cleared enough for a crewman to thrust his hand out and seize Jesse's sleeve. The man's cheeks were streaked black with soot. His eyes were small and furious. "You're crazy," he mouthed. And then the crew, saved from being burned alive by the rapid movement Jesse forced, laughed in a staccato of relief. The actual combat tempo compressed into a succession of vivid sensory snatches. A machine gun stitched a line of metallic snaps. It took only a few of those shots for men to feel the gravity of place. A mortar landed somewhere ahead with a thunder that moved through the ground as a pressure wave, raising dust and the smell of decomposed leaves. Flames seared a patch of undergrowth, and the air trembled with heat. Men smelled burning foliage and fuel, but avoided graphic detail. When a bunker breathed out smoke, it was not a theatrical cloud, but a suffocating thing that made throats raw and eyes water. Jesse felt the heat not as a distant fact, but as an encroaching presence. Yet methodically, in the chaos, the pattern of small, dangerous gestures prevailed. Point, pour flame, move, pull back the wounded, repeat. He did more than guide flame. At one moment, a tank's loader, pinned and scalded, fell half out of his hatch with his uniform alight. Jesse scrambled down and dragged the man clear, smothering the flames with his own jacket. The man's face bore severe burns. Jesse was not a medic, but he understood triage in practical terms. Stop the burning, staunch bleeding, move the man where the stretcher could reach. Later accounts mention that Jesse carried the loader a dozen yards through a hail of small arms fire to safety.
Those who were present wrote that the loader lived, and the memory of being carried by a steady pair of hands sealed Jesse's reputation among the men. Word of the improvisation spread through the battalion in the way it always does, first as an astonished rumor under the overhead leaves, then as a more formal commendation filed by officers who observed the result. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hart read the after-action report with a thin smile and a clipped nod. He recommended recognition. Sergeant Carl Rodriguez wrote home in a letter that Jesse had done what few would risk, praising the man's seamanship with flame and armor. The battalion's official notes recorded the tactical effect. Several defended emplacements neutralized, an opening exploited that allowed the advance to resume toward the airfield, and casualties reduced compared with prior estimates of continued frontal assault. Reports later described the breakthrough as a critical moment in the Hornet's Nest action, and they used terms initiative, field adaptation, that, bureaucratically, are the currency of institutional change. Change, however, does not immediately become doctrine. There is always a lag between what a soldier in the moment invents and what an army commits to paper. After-action boards convened. Technicians and ordnance officers inspected the modified tanks and made notes about nozzle placement, fuel capacity, and crew protection. The balance of risk, exposing a soldier on a hull to guide a weapon versus the lives saved among infantry, was debated in the measured language of procedure. Lieutenant Harrison, who had earlier been plain about the armor's blindness, argued that Jesse's method held promise, but needed refinement. A better communication system, standardized mounting points for an observer, an armor skirt modification to reduce blast exposure. Within months, the Army began experimenting more deliberately with combined infantry armor observation techniques and with purpose-built flame tanks. The sequence is not heroic so much as institutional. Engineers took field feedback. Ordnance officers wrote specifications. Manufacturers produced alterations to the Sherman that would become, in later yards and blueprints, the more capable flamethrower tanks. These machines would be designed to give crews some of the visibility Jesse had provided with his own body. They would carry more fuel, have better nozzle articulation, and incorporate armored observation slots for spotters. That the change had a human lineage was sometimes lost in the paperwork, but those who lived the Hornet's nest remembered. The Medal of Honor recommendation that followed Hart's endorsement closed with formal phrases and the date of awarding, March 18, 1944. Yet in the mess halls and letters home, the tale kept the detail that mattered. One man climbed, one man pointed, and one stalled advance began to move. The cost of such acts was never negligible. Men were killed that day. Others suffered severe burns. The language of reports is careful. Killed, severe burns, wounded. Jesse carried that language with him. He did not make speeches about courage. His courage was a working thing, the way his hands found purchase on metal and flesh. After the battle, he wrote home. In a letter, hand tremulous in its ink, he tried to explain the absurdity of the moment, the thinness of a telegram that had claimed his brother's life, and the thickness of the decision he took that morning. He wrote that grief had sharpened his focus rather than dulled it. Friends from his logging days later said the move was a natural extension of what he had always done. Assess, climb, fix. Only the stakes were greater. Years later, at a small ceremony, Jesse accepted his Medal of Honor with the same unadorned posture he had shown on the battlefield. He did not speak at length. Reporters tried to press him into pithy statements. He only offered a few words about the men he had served with, about the loader who had lived, about Robert. The medal sat on his chest as a bright, formal thing. The weight of it did not change the weight of the telegram he still kept folded in his pocket. The strategic effects of that action circulated beyond personal commendation. The Hornet's Nest episode was cited in doctrinal revisions and in manuals that would later guide mortar infantry coordination and flame weapon employment in close terrain. The idea that armor needed guided human observation in certain contexts was absorbed as a lesson. Sometimes metal must be married to the sensitivity of a human eye. Over time, the improvisations of the field informed purpose-built machines. Sherman variants designed to carry larger flamethrowers, with protective measures for observers, and systematic training for combined operations. The adoption was not instantaneous, nor was it inevitable. It required officers who would translate battlefield heuristics into formal doctrine, and technicians who would make the adaptation mechanically sound. Jesse returned to Michigan after the war. The logging camps that had formed his muscles were now quieter in the way of places that have been touched by sea change. He worked with his hands, married, and raised a family. The quiet of that life suited him. There were veterans' reunions where older men in uniform would find him in a crowd and grip his forearm like a lodestone. They told him again and again that his gamble had saved them, that his willingness to expose himself had made assault less costly. He kept answering the same way, a small half-smile, a practical note about how the tank handled on a slope, or a dry comment about the smell of burned fern. Sensory memories rather than grand claims. Public recognition was limited. Newspapers reported the Medal of Honor and the date, March 18, 1944,
and quoted official language about conspicuous gallantry.
There were photographs of him standing with other medal recipients, stiff-backed and uniformed. But the broader public, preoccupied with larger strategic narratives of the war, tended to skim past the granular stories of adaptation. Historians later pointed to Hornet's nest as a tactical inflection point in the Bougainville campaign. Engineers traced lines from improvised hull-mounted flames to later Sherman adaptations. Veterans and family preserved more intimate details: Robert's letter, Jesse's folded telegram, the loader's survival, as the true ledger of a day's worth of small, consequential decisions. Memory in war often operates as a palimpsest. Official narratives layer over field improvisations. Doctrine smooths the irregularities of human action into procedures. Yet in letters, in memoirs, and in the weathered folds of a telegram, there are traces that resist total erasure. Jesse's gamble did not destroy an enemy division in a single blow, as dramatic headlines might suggest. It did, however, break a localized defensive ring and catalyze a sequence of events that allowed an advance to resume with fewer losses than would have otherwise occurred. It forced an institutional conversation in which the utility of human observation in armored operations was finally recognized and built upon. It saved lives on that morning and, in a small way, informed later engineering choices that would reduce casualties elsewhere. In quiet hours, Jesse would sometimes stand at the edge of a small wood and run his palm over a log, testing its grain, the way he had as a young man. Flame and cutting and carrying had been tools he used when needed. They had not become trophies to display. He knew, with a certain calm, that acts done for the sake of comradeship carry their own gravity. The telegram never left his habit of pocketing small things. It was a reminder that war has personal ledgers. Who is present? Who is gone? Who bears the scars? Those who gathered in later years to tell and retell the Hornet's Nest story usually settled into a form of reverent understatement, a way of speaking that honored what had been done without elevating it to mythology. By the time official reports circulated beyond the theater, there was already a quiet lineage of change. Engineers sketched improved nozzle housings. Training manuals included exercises to practice coordinated observation. Men who had watched Jesse's action moved into roles where they could advocate for institutional adjustments. Lieutenant Colonel Hart's endorsement and the Medal of Honor awarded in March of 1944 remained the formal record. But the living trace of adaptation lived in the places where men spoke of how we did it rather than who took credit. On Bougainville, the Hornet's Nest itself sat afterward as a scarred ridge with new names carved on small stones in field cemeteries. Families received government letters explaining losses in the deadened voice of bureaucracy. Jesse's family received his brief notes about handling the aftermath in the only language he felt fluent in: practical support, small errands for widowed relatives, a check sent discreetly. The acts that break a stalemate are not tidy things. They leave behind bodies. They leave behind grief and long recoveries. They leave behind infrastructure that gradually absorbs the lesson at the cost of the moment's rawness. When historians later tried to trace causal lines, did one man's action change strategy? They found the answer both narrower and larger than the question implied. Narrow. Jesse's climb and guidance had immediate tactical effect, saving lives and opening a corridor.
Larger, the action contributed to a pattern of field-led innovation that, when recognized by command, altered equipment design and operational doctrine. The story's moral was therefore not a simple celebration of individual daring, but a sober recognition that practical courage married to institutional receptivity can reshape the tools and tactics available to those who come after. And so the image that stuck in veterans' recollections was modest and specific. A man on a tank's hull, hair plastered with sweat, a folded telegram in his pocket, breath sharp from heat and smoke, arms outstretched to point where flame should go. It was not the sort of scene that lends itself to grand headlines, but it is the kind that lives in the pedigrees of adaptation, the human margin that nudges the machinery of war into new shapes. The hornet's nest did not disappear from military study. It was a case used to teach junior officers about combined arms, adaptation under fire, and the moral calculus of exposing one person to save many. Men who once debated doctrine over maps now included in their deliberations a sentence that respected improvisation. When a field solution proves effective and survivable, formalize it, train for it, and engineer it. That was the institutional uptake of Jesse's gamble. Even as the Army made those technical adaptations, the living memory of Bougainville relied on quieter things. Letters passed between veterans and families, reunions in park halls, the slow accumulation of praise in memoirs. Sergeant Rodriguez's letter praising Jesse found its way into a small post-war volume of battalion recollections. Lieutenant Harrison's notes were catalogued with ordnance suggestions. The Medal of Honor certificate, dated March 18, 44, sat in a file, but so did the simple hand-lettered thanks from men who had felt their lives change at Jesse's insistence on pointing a nozzle with his own body. In that seam between formal recognition and private recollection, Jesse lived out the rest of his life. He grew older without fanfare. He repaired roofs, cut timber, and kept the telegram folded in the same place.
When asked about glory, he pointed toward the men who had made a way forward on that fogged morning, and away from any notion that a single action could be wholly credited with strategic victory. The real victory, he seemed to say, without claiming it in words, was that someone had been willing to combine practical skill and moral resolve at a moment when the difference mattered. The Hornet's nest remained, in military memory, not a monument to a single gambler, but a ledger of small decisions that added up to less loss and more movement. In that ledger, Jesse Ray Drowley occupies a particular line. A man whose trained hands and folded grief produced a practical answer to a lethal problem. An answer that altered equipment, doctrine, and the lives of men who followed. The ridge cooled, and the island healed in its own slow, indifferent way. Back home, some families placed flowers. Others never spoke of the names their letters had brought. The telegrams alike faded in drawers. Yet the tactical lesson persisted. Human ingenuity, when combined with institutional willingness to listen, saves lives. It does not erase cost or render violence picturesque. It simply finds ways to reduce the toll. In that reduction, there is a sober kind of heroism, unadorned, consequential, and often, in the long view, quietly transformative. On a late autumn afternoon, when the light lowered like a slow benediction, Jesse sat on the back step of his house with a cup of tea gone lukewarm. The roof he had mended that morning shed dry leaves into a gutter. His saw leaned against the shed like another veteran at rest.
Across the yard, a swing creaked under the weight of a granddaughter whose legs kicked at the air and scarcely thought about the men who had once crawled through smoke and steel so she might grow tall enough to touch the rim. Neighbors waved as they passed. Some still called him Sergeant out of habit and deference. Most used his given name and accepted the half-smile that came with it. He answered simple questions about shingles and how to set a joist. When asked about the war, he gave a straight, brief account. Where he had been, what he had seen. Then steered the talk back to the weather and a good local carpenter whose prices were fair. The way he folded the telegram and put it in the same pocket was as much ritual as memory. A small, steady action that neither surrendered nor celebrated the past. Letters continued to arrive. Not all were official. There were the occasional requests from historians, and the more frequent notes from men who had been in his battalion or men whose fathers had been. These letters often began with the same uneasy thing. "You won't remember me, but," and then went on to describe a face, a laugh, the exact way a man had reached for a canteen, a child born after a letter home, or the way a widow had kept a photograph on the mantel.
Jesse read them with a pencil behind his ear, sometimes answering slowly, sometimes slipping a quick note into an envelope and handing it to the mail carrier on his walk downtown. One spring, a curator from a university museum wrote and asked for permission to display a piece of equipment that had been modified in the way Jesse had helped to highlight. The letter spoke of field-led innovation and the interplay between human improvisation and institutional response. It used phrases that pleased archivists and irritated soldiers, bureaucratic language that wanted a precise chronology, an origin story with dates and catalog numbers. Jesse wrote back simply, inviting the curator to come by and see things as they were, no fancy ceremony, no need for cameras. The curator arrived with a respectful gait and hands that showed the traces of handling fragile things. He looked at the folded telegram, at the repaired roof beams, then at the scarred old nozzle Jesse kept in a wooden box. "We teach your story in lectures," he said quietly, "but we want to show students the object, the sort of thing that changed because someone on the ground acted instead of waiting." Jesse tapped the nozzle's handle with a finger. "It did its job," he said. "We used what we had. Then they made something better. That was the point." The museum did display the nozzle. The plaque beneath it could not carry the smell of diesel and cordite or the heat of the ridge. Instead, it carried the formal language of commemoration, a succinct paragraph about adaptation, an acknowledgement of human initiative. A small photograph showed a man with arms outstretched on a tank's hull, cropped so the horizon was almost invisible, and a line of text attributed the innovation to several unnamed hands, a recognition of collective action that both smoothed and honored the edges of the event. Younger officers who read about the Hornet's nest in doctrine manuals received it as a case study, a tactical vignette with a measurable outcome. They learned the steps, the decision points, the elemental calculus of risk to effect. Some of them met Jesse later in life, at reunions or at a small veterans conference, and were surprised by how unremarkable his speech was. He spoke in practical terms about angles and pressure and the value of improvisation. He spoke about grief the way one might speak of a stubborn leak, something that needed repair but that never quite went away. At a reunion in a hall where the heat hummed and the coffee stood in urns, a young lieutenant approached him with a syllabus in hand. "Sir," the lieutenant said, "we read your unit's after-action reports. We study the Hornet's nest. Could I ask you what you thought you were doing in that moment?" Jesse looked at the man who was a decade younger than the photographs he had seen of himself.
Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é narrador, palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era much younger than the photographs he had seen of himself. Você está no meio de uma frase ou pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. He thought of the ridge, of the weight of the flap of cloth that had been jammed into his pocket, of how quick his hands had been, even when his heart was not. I was pointing, he said. I was not thinking about glory. I was thinking about where the flame would go and how to save a man who had been pinned. There isn't any grander answer than that. We were doing the work in front of us. The lieutenant pressed the syllabus into Jesse's hands and later wrote a paper that used the exchange as a preface, less as an answer than as an insistence that decisions on the ground were human and not merely doctrinal. The paper circulated. It influenced a training module. It changed a sentence in an ordnance directive. The machine of learning had converted a human act into a teachable moment. The teachable moment, in turn, changed the training of others. There were larger, quieter currents that moved around Jesse's life as surely as weather crossed plains. After a few years, the manufacturers who had first resisted field changes began to accept them. Engineers visited depots and asked about the lived problems of those who used the equipment. Some meetings were awkward. The languages of factories and frontline soldiers rarely aligned cleanly. But there were enough moments of translation that designs shifted. No one would claim the nozzle as history's decisive innovation, but it became part of a seam in which small accretions of practice produced harder seams of policy. Within the battalion's post-war community, narratives grew into a tradition. There was the man who had lost a brother. There was the woman who had kept a pair of boots in a cedar chest until her own death. There were children who had asked their fathers more than once whether it had been worth it. The answers varied. Some said yes in ways that sounded triumphant. Others said it had been necessary and terrible. Jesse's answer never sought to moralize. If anyone asked whether his action had been worth the cost, he would shift his gaze away from the question's edges and point to a small map of the ridge he had kept in a drawer. It made a way, he would say, and ways save people. Time's erosion, however, was impartial. People grew older and died. Names were misremembered or lost. Where once letters came thick with urgent thanks, they slowed to fewer and more formal notes. The veterans who met at the park hall for reunions began to have more empty chairs than occupied ones. Flowers were placed in graveyards. Some congregations marked anniversaries with prayers. The Medal of Honor certificate held its place under glass in a file at a county records office, an official testament that had preceded any of the private thanks. For Jesse, the codified honor mattered less than the men he had known. Once, a young man appeared at Jesse's door carrying the uniform of a unit that traced its lineage to Jesse's battalion.
He was small, perhaps 22, with the earnestness of someone newly schooled in history. He wanted to be an officer, he said, and he wanted to know what courage felt like. They sat at the kitchen table while Jesse buttered bread, and their conversation avoided grand abstractions in favor of practical ones. Drink water, Check your men. Leave notes about the terrain. The young man asked why Jesse had not written a book or sought honors. Jesse's hands went, almost automatically, to the folding of the telegram and then to the rim of his cup. "There isn't much to tell that would make a story," he said. "The important pieces are the ones you can pass on without dressing them up. That you do what you can, that you look after the men next to you, that you keep your head. If you want stories, ask the others. They'll tell you where they almost lost a man and where they did. In the end, it's not the story, it's the next man's life." Not every life was reconciled by later understanding. There remained families who never spoke of names. Some houses had a photo that sat in a shadowed drawer. The ledger the story spoke of was not a neat accounting. It was a messy, living record where gratitude and grief occupied the same line. Jesse knew that. He knew, too, that the world would keep changing. What he had done would be taught as an example, reduced to points on a slide or a paragraph in a book, then adapted again to new contexts that might have no resemblance to the ridge in Bougainville. In the evenings, when the children were settled and the radio played something tuneless, Jesse would sometimes take out the nozzle again. He would turn it in his hands, feel the grooves worn by many fingers, and conjure the ridge like a map in his palm. He would think of the men whose lives changed because he had pointed. He would think of the way institutions had learned to listen slowly, and the way that when they did, tools and tactics were reshaped. He found a certain unflashy consolation in the idea that small practices could ripple outward and spare others. On a morning washed in clean light, a postcard arrived announcing a small ceremony at a military academy. An alumni group wanted to place the Hornet's nest case into a study hall dedicated to adaptive leadership. The note invited Jesse as a guest. It mentioned a plaque and a short speech. He thought for a long time. He called his daughter and told her the invitation was formal and that he would go if she wanted him to. She said nothing about the medals or the honors. "If you go," she said, "tell them the truth. Tell them what it felt like. Tell them how to make a way." He went. The academy smelled of wax and polished wood. Youngsters in uniforms sat rowed like thoughtful crops. A small crowd had gathered, some historians, a few of his old comrades, and civilians who wanted to see the object that had been pulled from the mess of the past and given a place in an institution that taught future leaders how to act.
The curator gave a brief speech that folded the artifact into a lesson about humility and empirical observation. Then they asked Jesse to say a few words. He stood, his back straight in the way of a man accustomed to posture, and he spoke not about himself, but about what the object represented. "This is not the nozzle exactly," he said, "but it is close enough. It is the thing that reminds you that when you are on the ground, you must use your eyes and your hands and not wait for a perfect plan. And when you do something that works, tell the people who can change the tools. We owe each other that much." The applause was polite and genuine. A few young officers asked for a photograph. A woman in the back, older than most, handed him a piece of paper. It was a list, names, addresses, men of the battalion who had, over the years, written in the simplest of ways to say thank you. Jesse put the list in his pocket. It would be another thing to fold with care. Outside the academy, the sky had gone flat and wide. He walked slowly to the car and lit a cigarette, an old habit he had never quite surrendered. He thought of the ledger again, the small decisions that added to something larger.
He thought of the men who had not come to the ceremony, and the ones who would never read a plaque about adaptive leadership. He let the cigarette go out in the palm of his hand, and did not bother to tamp the ash. On the drive home, the radio read a dispatch about a new design in field equipment that referenced the old practice under a footnote. He smiled to himself at the odd circularity of things. An action becomes a lesson. The lesson becomes policy. Policy becomes a tool, and the tool is used by a young man who has never known the smell of the ridge. The cycle continued, imperfect and human. That night, as he folded the telegram and set it carefully under the matchbox, Jesse thought only of the men who had been saved and of the men who had not. He thought of the ways small things, skill, the choice to move, the readiness to speak plainly to the people who held levers of change, could alter the arc of a life. The ledger added entries without ceremony. Its lines were written more often in acts than in words. He had been one hand among many that wrote a line. He would not pretend the line told everything. Outside, the porch light hummed, and the neighborhood settled. The world made its habitual noises. An engine passing, a dog answering the dark, the distant call of a train. Inside, the house smelled of tea and old wood. Jesse looked at the saw in the shed and at the list in his pocket. He nodded as if to an agreement only he could see, and then he went to bed. Morning would bring the same small labors and the same small consolations. There would be letters, an occasional visitor, repairs, and the quiet work of keeping a life whole enough to hold memory without letting it ossify into myth.
The Hornet's nest would remain a study, the nozzle a museum piece, the medal an inked name in a government file. But the ledger, the private, daily accounting of who did what for whom, would keep accruing, invisible and durable. And so the story threaded on, not as a single banner of glory, but as a braided cord of decisions and receptivity, of men who moved when it mattered, and of institutions that slowly learned to listen to the margins. In that braided cord, Jesse's line sat as an ordinary, necessary truth, that practical courage, when met with openness, can redirect loss toward life. He said nothing more that night, except to breathe. He slept with the postcard on the bedside table and the list still folded in his pocket, both small promises that somebody would remember, for a while longer, to make a way. He made tea before the house had decided to wake. The light in the kitchen was pale, and the radio, turned low, muttered about weather and distant trains. The words blended into the sound of the kettle. The list lay on the table like a small map. He smoothed it once and folded it again without looking at the names. Habit kept his hands busy while his mind traced the old contours, mud, flare, the brief arc of a good idea finding purchase in a frantic hour. There was a knock, sharp, not the hesitant rapping of a solicitor, nor the measured tap of the postman. When he opened the door, the woman from the ceremony stood on the step. She was shorter than he had guessed, wrapped in a coat that had seen many winters. Her hair was more silver than gray. Her eyes were quick and steady. "Mr. Lyman," she said. He remembered, suddenly, the way she had handed him the folded paper and the small steadiness of her hand. "Eleanor Hale. She held up a worn envelope. "I wanted to ask you something, if you don't mind. It's about the men on this list." He invited her in. She took off her gloves and sat at the kitchen table as if she had been there before. She did not fidget. She gave him, instead of thanks, a small, practical question. "We're gathering," she said. "A few of the families, some of the battalion, a couple of men who were there that day. No ceremony, just a room and tea. We thought, to the extent you wish to be present, you might sit with us. No speech, just share the table." Jessie glanced towards the ledger, then at the list in her hand. The invitation had a simplicity that suited him more than the plaque and the photographs. "Why ask me?" he asked. "Because those men wrote to you," she said. "More than once. Some of them left addresses. A mother wants to know whom to thank. A man who uses the adaptation says it saved his life again last year. They thought you should know." There was the usual temptation, the easier route to say no, but he found himself nodding. "I'll come," he said, "for a little while." The room in the community center was plain. Long tables, mismatched chairs, posters advertising coffee mornings long past.
Voices raised and fell like the small swells of an ordinary sea. He walked in and was recognized by a handful, old comrades, men with hands shaped by different trades now, a doctor who had once been a sergeant. A woman stood when he came in and shook his hand with a firmness that suggested apology for having to use such things. They did not ask him to speak. They left space, and stories began to arrive in it. A young corporal named Matteo, he looked not much older than the young officers at the academy, said quietly that he had been taught the nozzle's improvised use during an exercise, and then used it under fire in a way that had kept half his section alive. He had a scar that crossed his knuckles and a child's drawing pinned to his jacket like a talisman. He reached across the table and handed Jessie a folded scrap with shaky handwriting. "For the man who got me home." A widow named Claire read, with a voice that did not quite hold steady, a letter her husband had written before he died. He had described simply how a small change, worthy of ridicule among technicians and salvage men, had become the thin margin between breath and nothingness in a ditch 2 years before. He had written the letter because he wanted his children to know whom to blame if he failed to come back, and whom to thank if he did. When the pause came after her reading, the room did not fill it with platitudes. Someone boiled the kettle again. A child moved a cup. Jessie found himself aware of the ledger in his inner pocket as an ache of responsibility. It was not his to claim as credit, he thought. It was a thing that gathered other people's truths. "Why did you keep it?" Matteo asked later, when the chatter had thinned. He had the directness of his generation, a soldier's brevity in civilian clothes. "You could have given it to the museum." Jessie thought of the hall of the academy, with its tidy explanations and the curator's speech. He remembered the polite applause and the cameras angled just so. "Because some things are meant to be carried, not honored," he said. "The ledger remembers one way. People remember another. They need both sometimes. But not everything should be nailed to a plaque." A woman in the corner, Eleanor, had been watching him. She set the envelope down and, surprising him, smiled. "We're not asking you to give it up," she said. "Just to let us hold a small book of names, something families can look at. If you would write down who those men were willing to thanks to, maybe some of us can find them, or they can find us. Memory can stand a little community." They made a small plan.
Jesse wrote names from his pocket list onto a clean sheet of paper. Some addresses were outdated. Some men had moved on to places a map would call elsewhere. There were names he had forgotten until he saw them again in black ink. Each one opened a door briefly, a face hauled in memory from rain, a laugh like a spring, a silence like a new wound.
After the meeting, a number of people followed Jesse outside. The day had gone thin and cool. The light slatted through the trees. Mateo leaned against the rail and said, "You know, sir, I never thought of the person who does the small things as someone I should be writing to. We write to our mates, usually in jokes or dares. The serious stuff goes unsaid." He stopped. "Thank you for that, for making us think that writing down who helped matters." Jesse found himself telling a story he had seldom said out loud, about a man who had handed off a wrench at the right moment, about a file clerk who had kept a list of supplies that saved an entire patrol. Not heroic epics, he clarified, just small, reliable acts. The faces around him listened. When he finished, nobody applauded. There was only an understanding, a quick, bright accord. He walked home with the new sheet folded inside the old list. People he had known in other guises, students from the academy, men with names written inland on the paper, had come to him, and this was the strange thing a man noticed as he moves toward the end of certain currencies of his life, that gratitude did not always come as fanfare. Sometimes it arrived as a quiet question across a kitchen table, as a letter kept in a pocket. At the house, he opened the matchbox, took out the telegram, and smoothed it with both hands. He thought of the men who had been saved and the men who had not, of the small decisions that had channeled water into a cistern, and of the institutional machinery that sometimes converted those channels into canals. He thought of the Academy's plaque and the museum's placard, and felt neither pride nor disdain. Stories, he knew, needed both private edges and public faces. He wrote a line in his ledger that evening, not about one man, but about the simple principle that had endured. To name a favor is to make it durable. He added the new sheet to the list and left a copy with Eleanor for the families who would continue to look. He made no announcement. He did not relish attention. He wanted only that the people who had asked to know might know, and that those who had acted might not let their acts be swallowed by noise. Outside, the neighborhood slept. The dog barked once and then ceased. The house smelled of tea and the faint oil of the saw in the shed. The radio stood silent in the corner. He sat at the table until the light grew soft, then put the list in his pocket as he had so many times. The ledger remained on the shelf, a quiet ledger of what ordinary men had done and foregone to keep another breathing. It would not be placed under glass for long. It would be carried a little while longer. Before he went to bed, he walked out to the small graveyard on the edge of town. He had not come with ceremony. He did not like that. He laid the old telegram on the mantelstone of a grave, where a soldier had been buried without fanfare. He made no speech. He stood for a long time, listening to the wind move through the hedges, and felt the simple comfort of having done the right tiny thing. When he returned home, he sat by the window and looked at the horizon where the town met the fields. The horizon promised the usual work: repairs, letters, a meeting at the academy in a fortnight, perhaps a call from a young instructor who wanted to ask about improvisation in the field. That call might be the sort that leads to quiet changes. It might be nothing. Both were tolerable.
He went to bed with the list folded in the inside of his jacket. He slept as men do who have not sought glory, but have kept a ledger, and who have learned that to keep account is not the same as to tally praise. Memory, he had learned, is a communal work. It required hands on the plow as much as hands on the page. Morning promised the small labors again, and Jessie rose to meet them. Tea, the shed, a letter to a widow, a note to a man at sea. The braided cord of decisions continued, not as a single trumpeted line, but as an ongoing interweaving of choices and receptivity. He had not been the only hand on the cord, and he did not want to be. He only hoped to be one that had helped the braid hold. He folded the list once more and slipped it into his pocket. The ledger sat quietly on its shelf, and the world made its ordinary noises. Outside, a young man across the street set off for work with a toolbox. A woman down the lane hung sheets on the line. The flow of small acts went on, steady as a current. Jessie took up his pen and, in the margin of the ledger, wrote a name he had been given that afternoon, then another, and then, with the same slow diligence he had used in the field, he added the date. There were no headlines that week. There were, however, a few added letters of thanks, and a photograph that Mateo had sent of his daughter asleep with a stuffed rabbit he would not part with. Jessie pinned the photograph to the refrigerator door with an old magnet, and for a moment looked at the sleeping child the way one looks at a map of future obligation, soft lines where roads have yet to be laid. The work went on. Small decisions accumulated into a life that, to outside eyes, might look ordinary. To those who had been within the radius of that ordinary, it was everything. He made himself tea, and as the radio talked quietly of distant things, he thought of the ledger and the men and the woman who had knocked on his door and asked only that memory be made useful. He thought, not for the first time, of how a single practical gesture could redirect loss toward life. He turned the page of the ledger and began another small entry. The pen moved in the way a man trained by experience lets it, steady, neither hurried nor indulgent. Outside, the first car of the morning passed, and the day resumed its ordinary insistence. The braided cord did not unravel.
It tightened in the places it needed to. A life, imperfect as any system of men, went on.